two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Today, we're going to be talking about public power, and to make it clear what that is, that means public ownership of utilities. It's not just another way to say power to the people, though you could use that slogan here too. I'm here today with Augie Faller, who's a visiting lecturer at Cornell, but more important for us, a member of the EcoSocialist working group of Ithaca DSA, and someone who has been working on the theme of public power. And also with us is Jason Cortell, a resident of the Village of Groton and a business owner there, and therefore thereby someone who actually lives with public power. So to get started, Augie, tell us about the EcoSocialist working group of Ithaca DSA.
Our group is a subgroup within Ithaca DSA and also part of a national EcoSocialist working group. And we work on issues at the intersection of environmental, economic, political issues. And in particular, our focus recently has been on energy and on NYSEG, our local energy provider, because of their terrible record with respect to customer service, labor, etc. And ultimately, we'd like to see public power in this region. So I'm excited to talk to you about it.
So I understand there's a statewide public power campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's the Public Power New York Coalition is a coalition of grassroots organizations and nonprofits and labor groups in New York State. And we have a shared goal of having public, affordable, renewable, accessible, and democratically controlled public power in New York. And Ithaca DSA recently joined the coalition. And yeah, so it's a really cool group of people.
Who else is in the coalition? Are there groups we might know about?
So there are several DSA chapters that are members of the coalition, including New York City DSA, Syracuse, I believe Hudson Valley, and Ithaca. But then there are non-DSA groups as well. For example, the new Sane Energy Project, which I believe is based out of New York City, the Alliance for a Green Economy, which is based out of Syracuse, and the New York Energy Democracy Alliance. So there's a pretty good group of organizations, not just DSA, that are actively involved with this coalition.
Well, that sounds very good. So what is the Public Power Coalition trying to achieve in New York State?
So there's a whole list of goals or demands of the Public Power Coalition. This includes COVID-19 relief, affordable renewable energy, energy justice, energy production and distribution that's based on environmental justice and equity and democratic principles, as opposed to for-profit principles, good green jobs, and meeting climate crisis mandates. So it seems that New York is not on track at all to meet the requirements of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, or the Climate Act, that was passed in 2019. So a major goal of the Public Power Coalition is to get New York back on track to meet those goals. And also included in the coalition's demands are Indigenous rights. So thinking that a just green transition for New York State has to include and recognize Indigenous land sovereignty and the rematriation of land to Indigenous peoples. So it's really, I think it's a really exciting project, and I'm really excited that Ithaca DSA could get involved. And there are a couple bills in particular that the coalition's working on.
And yes, could you describe the two bills? I think you said there were two.
Yeah, there are two. I don't know them in great detail, but I'll describe them kind of generally. So there's the New York Build Public Renewables Act, which is basically an act to bring all generation and distribution of power in New York under the New York Power Authority, and to end the process, take over all private for-profit power generation and distribution in New York State, and with a goal of 100% renewable. Currently, New York Power Authority is not allowed to create utility scale power generation in New York State. So we actually need legislative action to even create the possibility of a state, producing renewable energy through the state power authority. And then the second bill is called the New York Utility Democracy Act. And this bill is more about creating democratic oversight over utilities. Currently, many utilities in New York State are private with very little regulatory oversight, but then also, we have no democratic say in their management. And so the goal of this act is to make sure that once the New York Power Authority takes over power generation and distribution in New York, then there's democratic oversight. So in particular, creating democratically elected utility boards to oversee operations and include observatory oversight by environmental justice advocates and other independent policy organizations, so that we get good oversight on energy production and distribution.
Yeah, right now I think the only state regulatory agency is the Public Service Commission, PSC. And one thing is that I think they have in their purview everything. I know they have things like cable television also, which is, very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
I recall once going to a hearing that they held in Lansing. This was about the power plant there. Was it going to be converted to gas, which eventually did not happen, luckily, but you could kind of tell that they weren't even used to holding public hearings. They didn't, people rambled on and got, brought up irrelevant stuff, and there was no discipline whatsoever, and people left by 11 o'clock at night with the whole thing still not finished. It was a fairly incompetent performance by the Public Service Commission, the PSC. So, so there are these two bills, one to actually, put New York on renewable energy, and the other to do it democratically. Is that a good?
That's my understanding. Yeah. Yes, that's my understanding. A lot of this information about the coalition can be found at publicpowerny.org. publicpowerny.org. That's the main source of up-to-date information about this coalition and what they're up to, what we're up to.
Okay, good to know. So I think actually it's fairly obvious. I have the question, why would public power be good for us here in Tompkins County? But it's a good chance to revisit these points.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out initially that public power, or that power, clean energy should be considered a right like water. And the only way we can guarantee that right effectively is by making it public. So I think that should be said at the start. But then also, as has kind of come up already, if we had public power, it would be democratically accountable. So elected officials would be in charge of it, or in charge of the people who are in charge of it. And so we would have some democratic oversight over the production and distribution. And also, the money we pay for energy would stay within the community or region. Right now, where I live, our money goes to NYSEG, but NYSEG is owned by a company, it's owned by another company, by another, and the major corporation I think is based out of the UK. So
Spain,
money,
I heard.
or Spain. Sorry, that's right. Thanks for correcting that. So money is being siphoned out of the region, and there's no reason why, out of the country, and there's no reason why it shouldn't stay here and either lower rates or improve service, improve jobs here. So I think the democratic control and not-for-profit, and then finally, as has come up, we need to transition as quickly as possible to completely renewable energy. And the only way to make that happen quickly, I think, is by having doing it publicly. As long as there isn't a profit motive for going fully renewable, we'll only see resistance from private companies to going fully renewable. So we have to do it, I think.
Yeah. Now, I can imagine that there are people saying, this all sounds wonderful, but it also sounds improbable. People are probably thinking that publicly owned power companies are pie in the sky. Is that so?
Well, there are a few things to be said. One is that communities have recently around the country switched to municipal power, and there are many effectively operated municipal power systems in the States. We'll hear Jason. And also, it's just, I don't really understand the argument, because as the coalition demonstrates, it's totally reasonable and possible to pass legislation to make this happen, even if it requires using eminent domain. Energy companies use eminent domain through state power to take people's property for gas pipelines. So I don't think there's anything unreasonable about the tools being used or the end goal. And especially in New York State, which is now under the control of Democrats, it seems like there's at least a window of political possibility for making it happen here. So on either the state or the local level, I should emphasize, our group is really working on both. We see these projects as being, mutually supporting, working on raising public support for local municipal public power or some nearby alternative. And we fully support the state instituting public power. We're working on both until one or the other comes to fruition. So that's they're slightly different goals, but we think they're mutually supporting.
Yes. So we have some really existing public power companies, including one in this very county, in the Village of Groton. And that's why we've brought Jason Cortell onto this show, because Jason is living with it. And I guess my very first question is this something that's really new in Groton?
Hi, Theresa, and thanks for inviting me on your show. So the first thing I want to say is just the bottom line is just kind of how boring and effective the public power in Groton is, and public power I've experienced elsewhere. You get the same electricity, you get the same or better reliability, and the price is a lot lower. So Groton, according to the Cortland Standard, Groton's power company started in 1896, and they put in a coal-powered steam plant of 121 kilowatts, which is pretty tiny by today's standards. And then they ran that until 1917, when they were losing money, and they leased it to a private company, which later became part of NYSEG, for 15 years, but decided in 1933 to take it back again. And they operated it from 1933 until 1962, using power from private companies. So they weren't generating their own power so much. In 1962, the New York Power Authority was set up, or at least became able to provide cheap hydropower to these municipal power systems around New York State. And so starting in 1962, Groton has had its own allotment of very low cost hydropower from Niagara Falls. And so the price for that is very low. I can talk about prices later if you like. And then if Groton exceeds its allotment, then it has to start buying power on the open market, and so the price goes up a bit from there. Typically, maybe a quarter of to depends on the season, but a quarter to maybe 20% of the power is at this market rate, and the other is the cheap hydropower from Niagara Falls.
Well, that sounds nice. Hydropower, and from New York State,
Yes,
I guess, unless it's from the Canadian side.
I think it's from the New York side, but I don't actually know.
Well, we don't exactly have to know that. And maybe you can also say something about reliability. I mean, does it mean more power outages than we get here in Ithaca?
You know, it's hard for me to say personally. There's been a couple of very short power outages since I've been living in Groton, which has been a couple of years. Compared to my power from NYSEG when I lived in Groton for 20 years, we had some really extensive outages up to over a week at one point.
Wow.
But that's a little bit unfair because we were up on a hill with lots of pine trees that kept falling on the power lines during an ice storm. So in terms of village power, I assume it's about the same reliability. According to national statistics, the municipal utilities average 74 minutes of power outage a year compared to 136 minutes a year for a privately owned utility. So almost just a little over half as much in terms of power outages.
If I could jump in here too, as part of our research, our group went through many complaints about NYSEG, for example, on the Better Business Bureau's website, on Facebook, on Google, and we collected many complaints. And there was a common theme of frequent and long outages, and NYSEG not responding to complaints. So one particularly vivid example that happened recently is that somebody's power was turned off because of a neighbor having an issue. So they turned off the power. And when she called NYSEG about it, they said, oh, it was actually a mistake. We intended to turn off your neighbor's power to fix something. But then they wouldn't come fix it. And a day or two passed, if I remember correctly. And she ended up saying that she called to report a gas leak to get them to come, and then ask them to turn back on the power because they wouldn't come turn on her power. Even though they admitted it was a mistake in the first place, that her power was even turned off. So those are the kinds of complaints, and worse, really, during the winter, people losing power and NYSEG not turning it back on for a couple of days. Those kinds of complaints are frequent, and that partly motivated us to get involved on this issue, seeing all the complaints, all the terrible reviews on Google, Facebook, Better Business Bureau, etc.
Okay, those are actually worse than my experiences. Now, I live in a pretty urban area, so there probably are genuinely fewer problems. Still, there are some, and I remember one several hours long, very unaccountable and unaccounted for outage. It was a couple of years ago. Never found out why.
I'd like to add that before I moved to Ithaca, I lived in an area in rural Oregon, very similar to the heavily tree-lined areas of Dryden that I lived in here. And we had a municipal or an electric cooperative running the power system there. And, the power reliability was at least as good, if not better than NYSEG. And the power prices were once again, half to a third as much as the private company would have had.
Well, Jason Cortell, you are an engineer and a numbers person. So perhaps you could talk a bit about the numbers, the electric rates.
Yeah, the NYSEG bills are pretty complicated. So I'm not going to claim that this particular set of numbers will apply to everybody's NYSEG bill, because it can depend on whether you're using some other electric supplier or whether you're using for the actual electricity or if you're using NYSEG. Either case, NYSEG provides the transport for the electricity to your house. So looking at my electric bill for Groton, the basic hydropower, the electric rate before the surcharges kick in is 4.2 cents per kilowatt hour. And that's mostly hydropower from Niagara Falls. And then it goes up to, and then my total bill, including the surcharges from because Groton used up all of its allotment of power last month, and had to pay some surcharges. So sales tax and other fees, my overall electric rate, including everything, was 7.3 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, comparing that to a typical small electric bill in Ithaca, where the person is using NYSEG power and transport, they're paying 11.7 cents per kilowatt hour, plus a $15.11 per month service fee. So if you put those things together, you can end up with 25, depending upon your size of your power bill, you can end up with power anywhere from 13 cents a kilowatt hour up to 50 cents, depending upon how much power you use. If you shop around and use a lot of power, you're going to be able to get your NYSEG bill somewhere around 10 to 11 cents a kilowatt hour, but that's still a lot higher than 7.3 cents per kilowatt hour. Nationally speaking, public power bills are about 13% lower than their private counterparts.
So it sounds like a good deal for consumers. And I'll just toss in a fact that you actually sent me by email. I'll just read it. 47 New York local governments have their own electric power systems, including Groton, Marathon, Endicott, Greene, Skaneateles, Penyan, and Solvay. So it really isn't anything that's all that new, and it's unusual, but not all that unusual. At this point, I'm going to turn back to Augie Faller and the EcoSocialist working group and ask about a few things going on there. You have been telling us about a Public Power 101 webinar. I think by the time this airs, it will be over, but what is that about?
Right. So it's scheduled for April 2nd, I believe. So we'll be over at that point. But the New York Public Power Coalition is hosting a statewide online Public Power 101. And we as a local group held a town hall recently also where we brought people together to express complaints about NYSEG. People brought their own personal experiences, negative experiences with billing, power shutoffs, etc. And there we did our own smaller 101 where we talked about some of the advantages of public power that we have been discussing today also. Moving forward, we're planning on having a follow-up meeting locally on April 12th. Information about that meeting can be found, for example, on the Ithaca DSA Facebook page. We'll be posting about that event when we have a Zoom link created and everything. So April 12th, I believe, is the date. You can look forward to that. Join us. Also, though, on the statewide level, there will be a series of events in April yet to be scheduled, but they're hoping to get the bills introduced in the next month, I believe, in the legislature, and then they'll have follow-up events on town halls, etc., to educate people, get people informed about what's in the legislation and to build support for the legislation. So that information, again, can be found on publicpowerny.org.
Have these bills ever been introduced before?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to.
Okay.
These bills are newly drafted legislation.
Okay.
So whether there have been similar bills in the past, I don't know.
Okay, but these are new, so they would be different in any case.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just, I was thinking about things like the New York Health Act and the HALT Act. And I think this Marijuana Act that just passed recently.
Right.
Where the bill has been introduced year after year after year, and the action may come this year or has come this year.
Exactly.
But this sounds like this is really something that's pretty new.
Yeah, the one green bill passed, and now we need the other green bill to
Yeah.
pass. And then I should mention another major thing we're working on locally is a ratepayers union. So we just introduced, there was a press release, I believe, in Ithaca Voice, a ratepayers union, meaning kind of an informal union of NYSEG ratepayers, so that we can work together, advocate for each other, and ultimately even work to prevent shutoffs of people's homes, etc. And so I would, we have a hotline we set up where people can call and leave a message if they are, for example, at risk of experiencing a shutoff, or if you're having issues with NYSEG generally. NYSEG is known, for example, to make paying bills very difficult for some people, etc. So for any kind of issue, we want people to call in and then see what we can do to help them. So I'll share the phone number for the hotline. You can call or text 607-442-4958. That's 607-442-4958. And we'll get your message that way through the hotline.
Great. So you'll be collecting more of the information. There was also a question about, I think there's been a moratorium on shutoffs during the COVID period. Can you say anything more about that?
Right. Yeah. So New York State had a moratorium on utility shutoffs that expires today, the day we're recording, March 31st. People it's expected that it will be extended. There's an extension included, I believe, in the budget that is supposed to pass today or tomorrow. But as of recording, it's not extended. And so we'll see what happens the next week. But we, as a group, want to be prepared to help people, advocate for people who are facing a shutoff, because we know, like water, power is not really an optional thing in today's society that you can just forego. So we want to help people and advocate for them, protect them from power shutoffs. And so that's part of the motivation for creating the hotline. And hopefully it gets extended. Hopefully the New York, the first bill gets passed, and that includes no shutoffs for anyone. That's one of the goals in the bill.
Good. Well, thank you, Augie Faller. Thank you, Jason Cortell. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thank you for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.